Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa, which means greetings from New Zealand. I'm Dave. This is my wife, Meegan. We lead the church in Auckland, New Zealand, which is on the other side of the world. And it's an honor and a privilege for us to speak to you this morning. We're grateful for your leadership, grateful for your faith, and all the service you do for God, His church, and all the universities spread across the U.S. Meegan and I were both converted in the U.S. and also trained in the ministry in the U.S. in Hampton Roads. So we're familiar probably with many of you that are on from the ACR region. So hello to all of you, and to those we don't know, greetings to you as well.
We have been grateful to be here in New Zealand during this time. We had an extreme lockdown, but that actually enabled us to be COVID-free in our country, except for the borders. So life here for us actually is back to normal. But when we watch the news, that's when we realize the rest of the world is having a hard time. And we've been praying for leadership in the US during these incredibly difficult times. But thank you for having us today.
If anyone can relate to being in lockdown, it's definitely Joseph. If anyone can relate to being isolated, it's certainly the character of Joseph. So we'd like to study out his life and his story and gain a few points to have leadership lessons from the life of Joseph. I'm going to read starting in Genesis chapter 41, verse 46, and read to the end of the chapter. Starting in verse 46 of Genesis 41, it says, Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim and said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph and do what he tells you." When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all of the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere. This is a familiar story, but in this chapter, there's basically 2 different trajectories. One is Joseph going from poverty to plenty. And in contrast, Egypt is going from plenty to poverty. But in both cases, it's very, very clear God is arranging these events. While the cupbearer has forgotten Joseph, God gives Pharaoh a dream, which needs to be interpreted. God is the one who arranged Joseph to be in charge of all the land. And it's clear from this story, and it's clear from the Bible, that God is always in control of human history. And it's very clearly stated in this text. And because this is true, we as leaders can have clarity, we can have courage, and we can look to Christ. Let's look at these 3 points as we study the life of Joseph. First, because God is in control, as leaders, we can have clarity. And Joseph is very convinced that God is in control. And as a result, he has laser-sharp clarity in this passage. In verse 51 and 52, look at how he names his sons. His firstborn, Manasseh. Why? Because God has made me forget all of my trouble at my father's household. The second son, Ephraim. Why? Because God has made me fruitful. And if you think about his sons and everything that he experienced, it's quite incredible that he comes out with such clarity that God is the one behind the scenes. He's sold into slavery in Genesis chapter 37, accused of rape by Potiphar's wife, in prison as a result of the accusation. Overall, spends 13 years separated from home, from family, as a slave and as a prisoner. Perhaps there were times where he thought, surely my brothers will remember and come for me. Surely there were times where he thought, I know my Father loves me and he'll come for me. And the years pass and it never happens. I know the cupbearer, when he gets up there, will let Pharaoh know that I'm the one that interpreted the dream. And definitely, all these things could have taken a toll on him mentally and physically and spiritually. Instead, he comes out of all of this with a very laser sharp clarity. God has made me forget. God has made me fruitful. All of the pain, all of the trouble, all of the nightmare, all of the hardship, all of the setbacks, gone. Because he was clear God was in control. And he believed God made him fruitful. He was definitely refined over those 13 years. He was not cynical. He was not critical. But he was clear that God was in control. Each time he interprets the dreams, it's the same thing. Chapter 40, verse 8, to the cupbearer and the baker. Do not interpretations belong to God? Let me hear them, but only God can answer them. And to Pharaoh, chapter 41, verse 16. Pharaoh wants his dreams interpreted. Pharaoh says, I cannot do it. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. And as the chapter ends, Joseph gives a very clear policy on how to prepare for the famine. And then finally, when he reveals himself to his brothers in chapter 50, verse 20, he says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to save many lives. And so all along the way, you can see this really sharp clarity in the mind of Joseph that whatever happens, whatever's going on, there is clarity. God will work something out. Leadership brings clarity in times of great uncertainty. Throughout this pandemic, it's been a privilege to be in New Zealand. Our Prime Minister has guided our country and been very clear the entire time about what we need to do and how we need to do it. We've had very clear alert levels and very clear principles and very clear practicals about what to do in each alert level. We were assigned to different bubbles where we could only interact with those people. Both the Prime Minister and the Director of Health were on the same page, being very clear about what needed to happen and how it would happen. And as a result of that, I think God is the one orchestrating it for sure. But as a result of such clarity, New Zealand has been blessed to be COVID-free. But even more so spiritually, we need leaders who bring clarity in times of uncertainty. One very clear application is you and I, and any leader, needs to be clearly convinced that I can't, but God can. During this lockdown, I had my own personal struggles and moments of refinement. Homeschooling kids, trying to teach my daughter how to do math, trying to teach my next daughter how to play the piano, trying to keep my son from just bouncing off the walls, trying to write sermons in the same time, speaking to a camera to people I don't even know if they're listening, trying to figure out how to grow the church. And as a result of all this, an inward focus left me discouraged, distracted, and depressed. And all I felt like was, I can't do it. But that was an incomplete thought, because to Joseph, he realizes, I can't, but God can. I made a decision to express that to the church, and I said, I can't move forward. I can't grow the church. I'm stuck. I need your help. Anyone who wants to join, I'm opening a Zoom link at 6:30 a.m. for the next 5 days. And anyone who wants to join, let's pray together. Let's get unstuck, because I can't, but God can. And it was so refreshing. There was a clarity that happened after these 5 straight days of prayer with different members of the church. And I clearly saw, I can't do it, but God can. And it's no coincidence that what followed was clearly the work of God. A man named Tato, who I met early February, contacted me out of the blue and said, I'm ready to come to church and I'm ready to study the Bible. We started meeting, studying the Bible. He's getting baptized tomorrow. And it's at the moment where I realized I can't grow the ministry, only God can, that he contacts me out of the blue and his soul is being saved tomorrow. I also felt like I can't connect to these influential people that can really help us reach a different segment of our city and of our country. I can't do it, but only God can. I thought maybe I should dress up and go to professional areas and look professional to try to reach out to people. But I can't really do it on my own, but God can. And shortly after having this clarity, a man named Mike Roberts started coming to church, who owns his own accounting firm and has owned several in different countries. And he starts coming and he says, this is my church. And we've been studying the Bible, and he tithes more than a lot of our members. And it's been so inspiring to realize I can't do it, but God can. 3 weeks ago, a politician came to our church service. He was inspired by our service. Me, him, and another brother met and had dinner that same night. And he said, I want to learn how to inspire people with truth. I'm a politician trying to do politics, but I want you, Dave, I want you and me to craft a message that I can use when I speak to the people so I can have them quest for truth. I was blown away because I can't do anything like that, but I finally realized God can. And my charge is stop being convinced. It's all about you, your routine, your plan, your program. All of these things are uncertain, and that's the permanent part of the landscape. There is always uncertainty, but God can. When is life going to return to normal? I don't know. When is campus going to restart? Who knows? How are we going to have church? How are we going to meet people? How are we going to study the Bible? How are we going to baptize people? I don't know. I can't do any of those things, but God can. And that's the clarity as a leader you and I need to have. Meegan's going to share some thoughts on this point as well.
I cannot do it. I love this verse in this chapter, verse 16, because I can relate to it. And I love the ESV translation even more because they translate it, it is not in me, but God will give Pharaoh the answers. It is not in me. How much do I feel this so often? You know, 2 years ago, roughly 2 years ago, we announced to church in 2020, we want to plant our first mission team in the capital city, Wellington, in New Zealand. We don't know how God's going to do it. We don't know who's going to go, where we're going to get the money. But this is our dream. This is our prayer. The church started raising money, praying, dreaming about it. 3 months after we announced that vision that we have, or this dream, I get a phone call. There's a woman in Wellington who's related to a disciple, and she wants to become a Christian. She's been secretly watching our services for a year. We didn't even know that. I fly down there, study the Bible with her, and she gets baptized. A couple months later, there's a couple in the church who wants to get restored back into the fellowship. Within a few months of announcing this dream, we have now 3 disciples in Wellington that we never knew God was working in their hearts. But 2020 comes around, and here we are. COVID hit because of finances and other reasons. We need to postpone the mission team. We're okay. All right, let's just keep going with our dream. It's been difficult to keep the faith, to keep the vision for the church. And then during lockdown, I get a call, email from a woman in America who decided to have a random devotional and just advertise it, a Zoom devotional. And this woman from Wellington happened to join it. They don't know each other. They're not connected at all. She loves it. She's been studying the Bible. And this week we decided we need to go meet her and help her become a Christian. But then we realized this week, a few days ago, oh my goodness, we don't have the money for this. We need to ask God. But this is God's heart. He wants people to become Christians. Surely he can provide. Just 2 days ago, I said to one of the sisters here, let's just pray. Let's just pray and believe God will give us the money to go in 2 days from now. And by the end of the day, we just shared it with the Bible Talk leaders. By the end of the day, we had money in our account, and one of the Christians said, in faith, we have doubled our contribution this month to be more radical for God. We would love for our money to go towards this cause. And I fly out in a couple hours to go study the Bible with this woman in Wellington. But there was this moment of clarity, of non-clarity, of like, oh, I see this need, but I see the obstacles. What are we going to do? And the women needed my leadership to have that clarity and that focus of God can provide. I don't know how, but let's just ask him. And sure enough, here we are. And we can't wait to study the Bible with our friend this afternoon. But I just want to encourage you to be leaders like Joseph, where he knows it's not in me, it's not in you, it's not in us, but God can. I want to encourage you to have the clarity during the famine and be able to watch God do miracles.
In addition to having very clear conviction about we can't, but God can, we also need clarity on where to focus. Joseph, upon being released from prison, could have focused his mental energy at the cupbearer. How come you waited so long before you let Pharaoh know? He could have focused his energy on the accusations of Potiphar's wife. Let me bring up these accusations that happened that wrongly put me in prison. He could have brought up the entire fact he was even in Egypt for wrong reasons, but he doesn't focus on any of that. He could have protested. He could have asked for release. Instead, he focuses on a plan to save people. He could not afford to waste time on areas that would not move the ministry forward. And this is such a big deal for leadership. We need to know very clearly where we pour our time and where we pour our energy. Yes, we speak out against injustice and inequality. Yes, we try to stage reform in the local community and want change, but that's not where we spend the majority of our focus. We grow our ministry, we train young men and women, and we shepherd them, and then we repeat. We grow our ministry, we train young men and women, and then we shepherd them, and then we repeat. If it falls under one of those categories, spend your time there. If it doesn't, find someone who's fired up about it and equip them to be involved in that area. But as a leader, if you lack clarity on where to focus, your ministry will be chaotic. There will always be the next issue to sidetrack us and distract us. There will always be something we could throw our energy into that is good. But Joseph realized, I got to have clarity and focus on the mission that is at hand. And I need to store away grain in order to save the people. And the question for us as leaders is, are you bringing clarity or are you bringing confusion to your ministry? When you're unclear, your ministry will be chaotic. When you are clear, your ministry will come and follow you. Because God is in control, just like Joseph, you and I and all of us need to have very clear conviction that we can't, but God can. And we need to know where to focus our energy, and laser sharp clarity leads people forward. In addition to clarity, we also need courage. If you consider the life of Joseph, he was a very courageous man. He was separated from his family, his homeland, and the people of God for 13 years, yet remains strong and courageous. And we have the advantage of connecting on Zoom and seeing each other and being encouraged by one another. And Joseph, isolated for 13 years without the fellowship, no leaders meetings, no Zoom connection, no YouTube videos, just dungeon and darkness. But he remains courageous to maintain his faith in God. Chapter 40, verse 10, Potiphar speaks to him day after day, and he refused to go to bed with her. There's a man of courage saying, I have to do what's right. He has courage not to completely blend in with Egyptian culture. In chapter 41, verse 45, Pharaoh gives Joseph the name Zephanath-Paneah, an Egyptian name, and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, to be his wife. He's trying to forced the culture on Joseph. But when he names his children, he gives them Hebrew names with very clear Hebrew references. Ephraim and Manasseh. God has made me forget. God has made me fruitful. Plus, he has the courage to speak to Pharaoh and all his officials fresh out of prison. What a man of courage. In chapter 41, verse 33, he explains the dreams to Pharaoh. He says, here's what they mean. And now listen to what he says in verse 33. And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. And then he goes on to explain a plan. What a man of courage. Here's what you need to do, Pharaoh. Look for somebody wise. And by the way, listen to my plan. What a man who has great courage. And that plan goes on to save an entire nation. I love the quote in Braveheart where William Wallace speaks to Robert the Bruce. Men don't follow titles. They follow courage. And that just sends energy and enthusiasm down my spine. Because he's telling him they don't follow titles, they follow people who lead the way courageously. And that's what you and I need to be, men and women who have courage because God is in control. Meegan's going to share some thoughts on this idea.
The topic of leadership has been on the world stage in the last 4 months. Hundreds of articles. If you Google leadership during COVID, there are hundreds of articles about leadership. Those that have succeeded, those leaders that are being effective, and those that are not. They break down all the different qualities and what's helped, what hasn't helped. But some things stand out with those leaders around the world that have succeeded. Those leaders have given clear direction and communication, and they also have had the courage to make the tough decisions and stick with those decisions. In the US, I'm sure, looking at all the states and all the different governors, there's been effective governors and not so effective governors in how they've led their states. But in the same way, this is an opportunity for us to rise up as leaders and examine our leadership. Do I have the clarity and do I have the courage to stand with what God stands for, to prioritize what God prioritizes? You might not be in the position to change laws in America, but you can change lives. God can use you to impact them. And we must have the courage to not be pressed by the culture and see past, okay, what is my mission? What has God raised me up for in my life? Our priority is not changing politics. It is saving souls, raising up leaders to also save souls. As an American in New Zealand, we're looking from the outside in to the US. And from this angle, I see a lot of young Americans on social media preaching about these injustices, preaching for social reform. People in the ministry so fired up about it, and amen. But what I don't see is them preaching also Christ. Preaching, and maybe they do that, outside social media, but if all people see is their social media, it seems that that is their number one priority at the moment. And even though these things are wrong and that we need to fight for injustices, we need to prioritize preaching Christ above anything else. We need to be leaders that have courage to keep it simple, take it back to Jesus, put God in the center. Courage to withstand the pressures and remind our people that we lead of God's priorities of saving souls. As Christian leaders, we need to have the courage to keep saying the same things, to not get frustrated at the people who get distracted easily, to have that clarity and courage to keep daily reminding our brothers and sisters the real battle in this world and the real spiritual warfare going on that God is trying to shake up and have a spiritual awakening in our world and in your country. So I want to just encourage you to be those leaders who will be courageous and continue to keep the focus and fight the good fight.
As leaders, we need to have courage in many areas. One of them is simply the courage to face reality. It's tempting as leaders to always spin something to make it sound better than it really is. Sometimes I've been at these staff retreats, and if nothing's going on in my ministry, it's very tempting to say we're on the brink of something incredible, or we're poised and ready to grow, or we're just about ready to take off. When the reality is, I'm distracted, I'm not focused, and there's nothing really going on. But it takes a lot of courage to face those realities. Without that, you can't really move forward. It's just wishful thinking. Maybe the reality is you've lost faith and you've lost focus and your ministry has lost faith and they've lost focus. But it takes a lot of courage to just honestly assess and say, we've gotten off track and we need to get back on track. It also takes a lot of courage to dream, because if the path forward was well lit, it would be crowded. And it takes a lot of courage for leaders to be able to dream. It's not coincidence that Joshua, the man who displayed courage to go in and take the promised land, is a descendant of Joseph, who displayed incredible courage during his time in Egypt. And God commands Joshua over and over and over, be strong and courageous. And he is to go in and help his country dream to take the land. Our church here is dreaming to plant a church in the capital city of Wellington in 2021. And it takes a lot of courage to even say those words to the church. It takes a lot of courage to repeatedly put that dream before the church. It takes a lot of courage to get everybody involved, even if it just means you're going to pray for the church in Wellington. But it takes a tremendous amount of courage and leadership to keep putting that dream before the church. And also to raise up future staff. I have 5 guys that I'm currently working with. I believe they can become evangelists in the next decade. And I'm dreaming to help them become the men that God wants them to be. Likewise with the women. They're training women to become future ministry leaders. And we want to see young men and women go into the full-time ministry. And we want them to share that dream with the generation under them. But it takes a lot of courage to repeatedly, consistently, intentionally, and deliberately help people dream. Another way to display courage is not adapting to the lowest standard. If our children don't like the dinner that we made, we don't make them an entirely new dinner. Instead, we raise the standard and tell them, if you don't eat that dinner, you won't eat. And there's this phenomenon that happens in leadership and in ministry where if someone gripes, or if someone feels hurt, or someone's too sensitive, or if there's a complaint, then, okay, now we need to rearrange and adapt to that member. And yes, I believe we should carry each other's burdens. Yes, I don't believe we should intentionally harm people or be insensitive. But the point is that leadership doesn't adapt to the lowest standard. They're courageously raising the standards. Following Jesus is a radical, radical endeavor. And it takes courageous men and women to consistently raise the standard instead of adapting to the standard. Men and women don't want to follow titles. They want to follow men and women who have courage. And as leaders, let's be those men and women who courageously lead the way, who courageously face reality, who courageously dream, and who courageously continue to raise the standards. And lastly, not only do we need clarity and courage, but at the end of the day, we need to lead people to Christ. Genesis 41, verse 56, when the famine had spread all over the country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere. And part of this plan that Joseph devises eventually becomes a relief center for Egypt and the entire Middle East. The whole world comes to buy grain from Joseph. If you wanted to survive during this time, you must go to Egypt and buy grain from Joseph. And of course, there's a parallel in here with Jesus being the answer and the solution for humanity once and for all. If you want to survive, if you want to have your eternity changed, you must come to Jesus. Only Jesus knows how to meet each person's individual need. Just like the entire world came to Joseph to survive, now we need to lead people to Jesus to help them survive here on earth and for eternity. I love how Jesus responds to Mary and Martha when he goes to raise Lazarus from the dead. Both sisters say the exact same thing to Jesus. In John 11, verse 21, Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Mary says the exact same thing in verse 32. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And Jesus responds to each of them differently. To Martha, he says, your brother will rise again. To Mary, he says, where have you laid him? And then he goes and he weeps. And I love that only Jesus knows how to meet each person's individual need. Martha needed truth. Your brother will rise again. Mary needed compassion. Jesus wept. But only Jesus knows how to meet each person's individual need. And in this story of Lazarus, everybody gets their needs met by Jesus. Lazarus raised to life. Martha gets what she needs. Mary gets what she needs. And this is such an important concept for leaders because often we teach our people to rely on us and our advice instead of leading them to Jesus. But only Jesus has the ability to meet everybody's individual need. There is no substitute. And there's no more important time than now, where the entire world thinks they have a solution. The entire world thinks they have an answer. If we promote this platform, if we protest in this way, if we support this program, then we'll get on the right track. That is not true. Only Jesus can solve and fix all of these problems. And we should not be leading people to these false hopes, but we should be leading people to Jesus. And I see it on the social media. I see that every platform is criticizing Christianity and negative about Christianity. And now, more than ever, we need men and women to stand up and say, I am not ashamed of Jesus. He is the only solution. He will change the trajectory of your life. And if you are in Christ, you will live forever. Yes, there will continue to be injustice. Yes, there will continue to be inequality. Yes, there will continue to be racism on this earth until Jesus returns. But once he does, and he carries us all home, only in Christ will everything be completely solved. And therefore, we need to keep leading people to Jesus. We can't solve their problems. You can't solve their problems. Only Jesus can. To conclude, we must be leaders who are thoroughly and completely convinced that God is in control. And as a result of that conviction, as a result of that deep-seated belief, we can become leaders who lead with clarity. Make sure your ministry knows the direction you're going. Make sure it's clear to your ministry. We're saving souls and we're training future young men and women to do the same. And let us be leaders who have courage to continue to raise the standards, to continue to dream, to continue to face reality. And let's be leaders who always lead people to Jesus. Amen.
Thank you so much for having us. We love you and you are in our prayers.
We want to pass on the motto that has been on the lips of many New Zealanders over the past several months, which is Kia kaha, which in Māori, the language of the indigenous tribe here, means stay strong. Thanks for having us. We love you heaps.